We read a number of bits from the Atlantic article that had come out and shared some of the New York Times. And part of our objection was, just like with the Together trial, the results were released and promoted in mainstream media as if they were scientific findings that everyone could assess, and therefore the fact that they were out there sort of implies that they have been assessed by the scientific community. But there was literally no paper at all. There was a press release, I think, or maybe just a couple of interviews. There was nothing. Well, that has now changed, kind of. So on March 20th, just 5 days ago, a couple days after our last live stream, they did indeed. That must mean something, but I don't know. They did indeed post something to Zenodo, a preprint server, although they call it a report, and they say, quote, I actually don't have the quote, they do not intend to publish this report in a scientific journal.
Really?
I wonder why. Well, when you look at the paper, you can begin to kind of see why. I have only skimmed it. I have noticed that a lot of other people have already dug deep and found, various problems with it. It's messy and confusing and pretty long, and the authors say in their little preamble they're not going to publish this as a scientific paper. Like, what does that just give them cover? Like, oh, we put a thing out, but well, it's not really the real thing. So it's just like it's one feint after another. And near the end of the paper, they say the authors claim that, quote, data accumulated since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic point clearly to a zoonotic origin of SARS-CoV-2. And then they proceed to make a series of the weakest arguments I can possibly imagine. I mean, it's really remarkable what, like, the level of analysis, and that they basically don't expect anyone to check their work. Like, they started by not letting anyone check their work, and now they put something out where they're like, yeah, but it's not really a paper. We're not going to submit this to a journal. And yet they make these claims that just sound like the strongest claims possible, but the actual claims aren't. They're insane.
Well, in fact, they said this was the strongest evidence yet for a zoonotic origin.
This like finding some bits of raccoon dog genome in the same place as some SARS-CoV-2.
Right, some really weak circumstantial evidence that is actually perfectly consistent with the idea that the Wuhan Institute of Virology is close enough to the seafood market that people who work at one are liable to shop at the other.
And we know there was SARS-CoV-2 there, and we know there are raccoon dogs there, so this evidence doesn't give us anything to do.
It's not evidence. And so what they are doing, and we need a name for this, and at the moment I don't have one. It's somehow, it's like headline priming or headline ginning, right? The whole idea is to pretend that there is science that justifies a headline, and that it's a data flow problem where they're going to put out the conclusion of the paper, and of course the paper's coming, and it will it's basically the bad habit that science folks get into, where they will read the abstract of a paper and they will not figure out whether the methods section justifies it or the statistics that were done were correct or any of those things. So the idea is you read the abstract and the whole thing is based on trust. This is like, well, we're not even going to give you an abstract. What we're going to give you is the headline you would write if there was an abstract that was justified by a paper. Right. And then we're not going to follow up with the paper because, of course, the value of the whole thing is the exercise of producing the headline. And why would you go through why would you put yourself at risk of having your headline invalidated by scrutiny when you could just allow the headline to float for good as if a paper had emerged?
Yes.
This has been going on a long time, by the way.
Yes, it has.
I remember this from the death of Dolly, the sheep. Right, who was...
So this is going to have been like late 90s, early aughts?
This is going to be early aughts. And I had a dog in the fight because in my paper on telomeres, I had predicted that she would die of age-related pathologies anomalously early, and they said she didn't. Did they give us a paper? No. They said, they literally put out a press release in which they said that they would do a full necropsy and they would let us know if they found anything, right? Which is insane because at the time that Dolly died, she was, of course, the oldest mammal clone on Earth. And so a full necropsy doesn't begin to explain what they should have done for this animal. They gave the implausible explanation that they had put her out of her misery because they couldn't stand to see her suffer from the pathology that they swore was not age-related.
Yep.
But, okay, whatever the cause of death, this animal should have been thin sectioned one end to the other so that future researchers could go back and figure out what was taking place there. Necropsy is not the beginning of what they should have done. But anyway, my basic point was there was no paper there either, right? This was a case in which there was a lot at stake, a lot financially at stake, because the patent on nuclear transfer cloning was incredibly valuable, and its value would be lower if it caused age-related pathologies. So in any case, the trick of creating a headline or creating an impression that scientific work has been reported, but not actually presenting the work, is a tactic that one should expect to see where there's a great deal at stake, either with respect to something like COVID origins or with respect to something like a valuable patent like nuclear transfer cloning. And I would also point out that, interestingly, that report on raccoon dogs, it came in advance of the revelation of a paper that Robert Malone called Smoking Gun on COVID origins, where basically it reported an experiment in which...
this week? In the last 4 days?
Yeah, last week, somehow.
But, I mean, you just said that the report here predated...
The headline, the initial report in which we all got the word that something important had happened with raccoon dogs, right, preceded by less than a week the revelation of this published work in which the enhancement of SARS-like CoVs to become infective of humans was discovered in the literature. So anyway, check out Robert Malone's Twitter and search for the term smoking gun, and you will find that research.
I'm reminded, you can show my screen just briefly. This is an article published in Forbes in 2020, in July 2020, in which they say, you must not do your own research when it comes to science. And they make this argument that it's just too tough, it's too challenging, and you're putting yourself and everyone else at risk by doing so. And compare that to, Zach, if you would give me my screen back for a moment so I can show this paper. You can now bring up this. This is the report that they say is not destined for a journal, in which they make introductory remarks and say, among other things, they say somewhere in here that they are not going to submit this to a journal, but this paper is, this report is not intended for publication in a journal. There it is. They start with key points, which is sometimes done in an actual scientific paper, but this is accessible if they would share more information, the likes of which you're supposed to do in science. And to have this kind of analysis happening at the same time as, granted, that Forbes article is from almost 3 years ago, but throughout this we've been told, don't ask questions, don't do your own research, don't assess for yourself, simply trust the authorities who've shown up with credentials that you may or may not be able to assess, with backgrounds and with skills that you may or may not be able to assess, and don't pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Pay no attention to the fact that the entire system has been so corrupted by the role of money and federal granting agencies that the vast majority of people who are now doing science in the West, at least in the US, are doing little tiny reductionist pieces of science and will actually say, if you ask them questions outside of their little domain, well, that's not my concern. So why would we trust world health to people who will say, no, I just do this thing. I just do this little thing. And when you go looking, I spent a little bit of time looking at the backgrounds of a few of these authors who, aren't the ones that we keep on hearing about. And indeed, they're just doing this narrow, blinders on science for their entire careers. And where's the evidence that they actually know how to assess things? I don't find it.
No, and clearly they don't. For them to put their name to this, clearly they don't uphold any such standard. And I will point out, so much of this, so much of the malfeasance here come down to the application of two different standards depending upon whether you're on narrative or off narrative, right? Almost all of this, the things that people who are dissidents are accused of violating the sacred rules of science, the fact is those who are on narrative are granted no end of leeway in the same direction. So if you were to simply apply any consistent standard, you would come out with a far better answer than we have. And in fact, what's happening is, somebody is peeking at who it is who is engaged in work and deciding whether to institute an impossible standard that can't be met or no standard at all so that you will meet it irrespective of whether what you've effectively done is publish a newspaper headline without a method.
Yep.
And anyway, of course this crashes the world, right? Science is not capable of, science isn't a posture. It's not a costume, right?
It's also not optional.
Right.
And we've taken it for optional. It's like it's an affectation for many people who are calling themselves scientists.
Yeah. You actually have to do the method correctly, and you have to do it according to the underlying philosophy of science, or it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Right. The fact that it involves sciencey looking stuff or sciencey language has nothing to do with it. People with degrees, it doesn't matter. You either did the method right or you didn't.
Yeah. As long as we spend a little bit of time here, let me just provide some of their evidence for their incredibly strong claim. So you can show my screen again here, Zach. This is again from the report. Purporting to show the strongest evidence yet that SARS-CoV-2 had a zoonotic origin. Data accumulated since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic point clearly towards a zoonotic origin of SARS-CoV-2. Oh. 1. A preponderance of the earliest hospitalized COVID-19 patients were linked to a single location.
Really?
2. The locations of early severe COVID-19 cases without a clear epidemiological link to the market, to the Huanan market, nevertheless were so centered on and close to the market that it is clear that community transmission of SARS-CoV-2 began in this local area and only later expanded across Wuhan.
Incredible. Which, of course, depends on a correct start date for the pandemic.
Oh yeah, and they're definitely sticking with January, January-ish, 2020 in this paper.
This is nonsense.
And it's all about the location. Almost all of their pieces of evidence here, the strong, overwhelming evidence, and then let me just finish with these arguments stand in stark contrast to the absence of evidence for any other SARS-CoV-2 emergence route.
The absence of evidence. That's fascinating, even in the genome of the thing. Here's what they're doing, right? A, this couldn't possibly convince anybody who's paying attention in detail, right?
I think.
So the purpose of this is to convince people who are not paying attention that something has happened that has swung the pendulum in the direction of natural origin, right?
Yep.
So, and there's a vast number of people in that category, right? These are people who are, glued to their New York Times and haven't understood that it is a propaganda arm of the government and who knows what else, right? These are people who just need the headline itself. And so the idea that there is like this cottage industry of generating headlines that serve the right people's interests and cause some large percentage of the audience that isn't doing its own research in any regard to jump.
Well, it feels like this report, like not even a preprint, right? Because they say they're not going to submit it to a journal. Seems like this report, those bits that I just read, are actually written to be pulled and quoted by the mainstream media.
Right.
Like this is not written for scientists. It's written for the media to do pull quotes. And I don't know. That's a hypothesis.
It's written,
but it doesn't feel that little bracketed argument that I just read part of. I cannot remember, as bad as the scientific literature is, I cannot remember ever seeing anything so transparently flimsy in the discussion section, which is what that would more or less be of an actual scientific paper.
It actually is the private citizen analog of, the busy scientist reading abstracts, right? Mm-hmm. There is a citizen that just pays attention to what the New York Times has concluded, right? Oh, Natural origin, strongest evidence yet. Why? That does sound strong.
On top of already strong evidence.
Right. And what's that you say? There's no evidence at all for a laboratory origin? Fascinating. Geez,
Yeah.
I wonder what those people...
Well, on one side we've got evidence, and on the other side we have no evidence.
Right.
Well, I know which side I like.
Yep. And so, we certainly saw this with ivermectin in the Together trial. 6 months of looking at a slide from a presentation without a method. And then when you get the method, it is, of course, fraudulent and caps the dosage. This is a trick, right? The purpose of the trick is in the New York Times, right? It's not to convince anybody who understands science, who is paying attention to the evidence, because it couldn't. It's too thin. There is no evidence here.
Right. And combine that with articles like in Forbes in 2020 saying, when it comes to the science, do not do your own research.
Right.
Like really, that is literally the argument coming across the transit people. It is your civic responsibility to accept what we say. And I would argue, and we have argued many times, it's actually your civic responsibility to do no such thing. It is your civic responsibility to do the opposite. At the point that they tell you it is your civic responsibility to just accept what we say, you need to say, actually, now I will not.
Yeah.
Not you are inherently wrong because you said that, but now I will explicitly ask for all of the evidence that you have laid out in as clear terms as possible so that I can assess.
And most of the people who are being chastised for doing their own research aren't doing their own research per se. What they're doing is listening to unsanctioned channels where people like you and me who did study biology, have the relevant degrees, not only a biology degree, but evolutionary biology, which is highly relevant to many different facets of what unfolded under COVID. Like listening to us and figuring out whether we're making sense is a totally reasonable thing for somebody who does not believe that they have the toolkit to do the analysis themselves to do, right? And then how would you know if you're being suckered? Gee, I don't know. Track record? Would that do it? Right? The point is, they're trying to spook people. They're trying to poison the well of, well, what would you do if you didn't trust the official narrative? Maybe I would listen to people who were, well qualified and also didn't trust the official narrative, see what they have to say. And if they turn out to be wrong across the board, okay, maybe they're not good at it. But if they turn out to be right across the board, I'm not going to make excuses over it.